At 7:55 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, Messman Third Class Doris Dorie Miller was doing exactly what the United States Navy expected of him. He was collecting laundry on the battleship USS West Virginia. Tied up along Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor, a big, quiet ship in a peacetime harbor. Then the sky tore open, engines screamed low over the harbor. Bombs hit with a flat, physical crack that went straight through steel. A torpedo slammed into West Virginia's hull and threw Miller off his feet. Lights went out. Steam lines ruptured. Somewhere deep in the ship, men started screaming for help. Miller did what he'd been trained to do. He ran to his battle station in the magazine. It was gone, wrecked by the first torpedo. The Navy hadn't written a page in the manual for that, so the 6'3", 200-pound messman with no combat rating went looking for another way to be useful. On the upper decks, the world was on fire. Oil burned on the water. Japanese torpedo planes knifed down the length of Battleship Row. Men staggered past him soaked in fuel and blood. Somewhere above, his captain lay torn open by shrapnel. Miller helped haul wounded officers through smoke and broken metal. His white messman's apron smeared black and red. Then somebody pointed him at a weapon he was never supposed to touch, near the bridge. A .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun sat idle, its trained gunner dead or wounded on the deck. A sailor shouted a few rushed instructions over the roar of the attack. Miller stepped in behind the grips, planted his feet, and pulled the trigger on a weapon he had never been formally taught to use. For roughly 15 minutes, that just a messman stayed on the gun. Later, the paperwork would speak carefully of one, maybe two enemy aircraft destroyed. Miller himself would only say, "I think I got one." But shipmates and wartime reporters swore they saw more than that Japanese planes breaking off. Trailing smoke, crashing into the harbor under his fire. In their memories, the number climbed as high as 4 in that first brutal quarter hour. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to touch that gun. And yet, in those 15 minutes, Doris Miller crossed a line the Navy itself had drawn in front of him. If you want to see how a black mess attendant the Navy saw as just a messman became one of America's first heroes of World War II, and why his story still bothers the institution he fought for, please hit that like button. It helps keep stories like his from disappearing again, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The road that brought Miller to that gun, and to that morning in Pearl Harbor, started a long way from Battleship Row. Doris Miller grew up about as far from Battleship Row as an American kid could. He was born in Waco, Texas, in 1919, the son of black sharecroppers trying to keep a small farm alive in the middle of the Great Depression. From a young age, he hauled water, fed animals, and did whatever heavy work his parents needed. By his late teens, he stood well over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 200 pounds at chance, the kind of build that made him a natural fullback on his segregated high school football team. School did not last. Money mattered more than grades. And Miller eventually dropped out to help keep the family afloat, cooking and doing odd jobs, like a lot of young men from poor families. He looked at the Navy as a way out to steady pay, a chance to travel, and one less mouth for his parents to feed. In September 1939, just before his 20th birthday, he enlisted. The Navy did not see an athlete or a potential gunner. It saw a black recruit, and that meant the steward's branch. Mess attendant was one of the few ratings open to African Americans at the time, and it locked them into work that looked a lot like what Miller had done at home cooking, serving, cleaning, carrying, after training in Norfolk. He went to sea and eventually reported aboard the battleship USS West Virginia as a mess attendant. Third class, on paper. His world was small. His job was to serve meals in the wardroom, clear plates, wipe tables, make bunks for white officers, collect laundry bags, and keep quiet while other men talked about tactics and gunnery. The Navy's rules made it very clear men like him did not stand behind guns, they stood behind coffee pots. Yet the ship's routine still shaped him for what was coming. The cramped passageways, the smell of hot steel and fuel oil, the rhythm of drills and inspections, all of it became normal life. By the time West Virginia steamed into Pearl Harbor in 1940 to join the Pacific Fleet, Miller was just another face in the background of a proud but complacent battle line that believed war, if it ever came, would not start with them. When Doris Miller walked up the gangway of USS West Virginia in 1940, the battleship represented everything the U.S. Navy believed about power in the Pacific. She was one of a line of 8 big ships that made up Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor. Moored bow to stern along Ford Island as a floating statement, the Pacific Fleet is here. And no one in their right mind will challenge it. Moving the fleet from California to Hawaii was supposed to deter Japan, not invite an attack. On paper, the situation looked safe. The harbor was thousands of miles from Japan. The battleship sat in water shallow enough that if one were sunk, it could probably be raised. Fuel, ammunition, and repair facilities were all within easy reach. Pilots flew training missions, gunners drilled on their stations, and war plans talked about meeting the Japanese somewhere far out in the Pacific, not inside the fleet's own anchorage. In reality, the setup was full of vulnerabilities. The battleships lay side by side, each one masking the other's view of parts of the sky and harbor. Their anti-aircraft guns, both .50 caliber Brownings, 1.1-inch Chicago piano mounts, and dual-purpose 5-inch guns were powerful on paper but depended entirely on having crews at their posts with ammunition ready to feed. On a quiet Sunday morning with the ships at anchor, many of those guns were either unmanned or partially manned. Ammunition lockers were locked. Ready-use clips and belts were limited. The assumption was simple if trouble came. There would be time to man stations and bring the fleet to life. The airfields around Pearl Harbor were set up the same way. Fighters and patrol planes were parked in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, close enough together for guard details to watch them easily but dangerously vulnerable to any concentrated airstrike. Anti-aircraft fire control systems were not on a wartime footing. Radar sets were new, imperfectly understood, and not integrated into a robust alert network. The idea that a major power would risk everything on a long-range carrier strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor seemed, to most American planners, unlikely, bordering on impossible. Beneath all of this sat another layer of complacency, the Navy's own personnel system. Black sailors like Miller were largely confined to the messman and steward ratings, organized in a separate branch that existed outside the general service. Their jobs revolved around feeding and serving officers' cooking, waiting tables, cleaning cabins, shining brass. They wore different insignia and had almost no formal path into gunnery, engineering, or the technical ratings that controlled the ship's weapons and sensors. As one post-war study dryly put it, the steward's branch was composed of seagoing bellhops, an entire category of men the Navy did not plan to use in combat roles. That division looked tidy on a personnel chart. In a real attack, it created a brutal kind of math. You had one group of sailors trained to operate the guns and another group physically strong enough to move ammunition, haul wounded men, and if necessary, stand behind a weapon, but officially barred from doing so. The system assumed there would always be enough trained gunners alive and conscious to keep the weapons firing, and that messmen would always be available to serve meals and keep the ship running smoothly in the background. At 7:48 a.m., on December 7th, 1941, Japan's first air fleet launched the first wave of its attack on Pearl Harbor. 83 aircraft torpedo bombers, level bombers, dive bombers, and 0 fighters fanned out toward Oahu. Their orders were explicit. The torpedo and level bombers were to go for the battleships on Battleship Row. Dive bombers would hit airfields and other key targets. Fighters would strafe anything that moved. Minutes later, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers came in low over the harbor, lining up on the anchored ships. West Virginia, moored outboard at berth F6 with USS Tennessee between her and Ford Island, presented a broad, easy target. In quick succession, she took multiple torpedo hits along her port side and at least 2 bomb hits from above. Her anti-torpedo blisters were ripped open, compartments flooded, and the battleship began to settle into the mud, kept from capsizing only by rapid counter-flooding and the support of the ship moored alongside, on the higher decks and exposed platforms where many of the anti-aircraft guns were mounted. The first explosions were devastating. Men at their posts were killed outright, knocked unconscious, or blinded by smoke and flying metal. Communication lines broke down as phones and sound-powered circuits were cut. What had been a carefully organized web of gun crews, ammunition parties, and fire control stations turned into a scattered collection of survivors trying to make sense of an attack they had been told was unlikely. Some ready guns did open fire quickly, and overall anti-aircraft fire across the harbor grew intense within minutes. But effectiveness lagged. Weapon systems that had seemed adequate in drills struggled to hit fast. Low-flying torpedo bombers and dive bombers that attacked in coordinated waves. Tracer lines stitched through the air. Yet the Japanese pilots continued to press home their runs with grim discipline. On West Virginia, that meant pockets of the ship were fighting hard, while other weapons sat silent. Not because the guns were defective, but because the men trained to operate them were dead, wounded, or cut off, and the Navy's own rules had made sure that many of the physically strongest sailors nearby had never been formally taught to take their place. Black mess attendants like Miller were present in large numbers on the battleships and auxiliaries at Pearl Harbor. But their training had focused on trays, not triggers. As torpedo wakes foamed past the hull and bombs punched through decks along Battleship Row, the institution's blind spots started to show. The fleet that had been concentrated at Pearl Harbor as a symbol of deterrence was, for the first critical minutes, a line of almost stationary targets. The air defenses that looked solid on paper were struggling to find and hit fast-moving attackers. And on ships like West Virginia, some of the heaviest guns had no one left behind them while strong. Willing sailors stood close by, officially assigned to pour coffee and carry laundry. That was the reality Doris Miller walked into when he reached the upper decks, a battleship bleeding out in a harbor that had become a killing ground. Guns looking for hands, and a system that had never planned for someone like him to be the one to fill the gap. The moment that pushed Doris Miller toward that .50 caliber gun did not look like a decision at first. It looked like following orders. When the first torpedoes struck and his magazine battle station turned out to be a wrecked compartment, he did what any disciplined sailor was supposed to do. He went looking for someone who could tell him what to do next. He reached the ship's central passageway crossing, the spot the crew called Times Square, and reported himself ready for other duty. From there, officers sent him where his size could make a difference. Up near the conning tower, Captain Mervyn Bennion had been ripped open by shrapnel, his abdomen torn when the first bombs and shells hit the bridge. Lieutenant Commander Dwyer Johnson, the communications officer, saw Miller's build and ordered him to help move the wounded captain. Miller and another sailor struggled to lift Bennion, get him onto a makeshift stretcher, and shift him away from the most exposed part of the damaged bridge. All while enemy aircraft were making their first passes over Battleship Row. Bennion refused to abandon his post, still asking for reports on the ship's condition and giving orders even as blood seeped through the bandages. Miller's official job description stopped there. A mess attendant could carry laundry and he could carry wounded men. Nothing in his training suggested that the next logical step was to pick up a weapon. The Navy's personnel system had spent years telling men like him that gunnery was not their business. That morning, the battle did not care. Near the damaged conning tower, two unmanned Browning 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns sat on a platform aft, pointed uselessly at a sky filling with Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Frederick White and Ensign Victor Delano, both young officers Miller knew from serving them in the wardroom, moved toward the guns and needed hands to keep them fed. They grabbed the big messman they recognized, pulled him into position, and in the middle of the chaos gave him a crash course in how to run the weapon he had never been allowed to touch in peacetime. The instructions were simple because they had to be. Point the gun where the planes are coming from. Lead them. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Watch the traces. At first, the officers expected Miller to do what the system always asked of him, support someone else. The original plan, if there was one, was for him to stand beside the gun and feed belts of ammunition while a trained white sailor handled the aiming and firing. Delano later recalled turning away for a moment, and then looking back to see that Miller had taken the starboard gun himself and was already firing. That was the real crazy idea at the heart of the story. Not a new weapon or a radical tactic, but a black mess attendant deciding, in a split second under fire, to step through a line the Navy had drawn in front of him his entire career. The manual said gunners had to be trained. Tradition said men from the steward's branch did not man weapons. Unwritten rules about race said that if something went wrong, blame would land harder on him than on anyone else on that platform. There was no formal preparation for that decision. The closest thing Miller had to training for this moment came from somewhere else entirely: years of farm work in Texas, time on the ship's boxing team, and a body used to absorbing impact and staying balanced under strain. On West Virginia, he had become the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, learning how to read an opponent's movement and keep his feet under him when he was hit. Now, standing behind the heavy Browning, he would have to keep his balance on a listing, burning deck, and learn to track targets at more than 200 miles an hour in real time. The mechanical side of the gun was straightforward but unforgiving. Each 50 caliber round was a heavy, finger-length cartridge meant to punch through metal and engine blocks. Belts had to be laid correctly to avoid jams. The gun would climb if he held the trigger too long. The recoil would batter his shoulders through the metal grips and shake his stance if his feet were wrong. Under training conditions, a new gunner might have spent days learning to manage those forces, firing at towed sleeves or target drones. Miller had a few shouted sentences, the example of the officer on the port gun, and whatever he could figure out in the first few bursts. Around him, the situation was only getting worse. More torpedoes had hit West Virginia's port side. Fires were spreading, smoke and spray cut visibility, and the second wave of the Japanese attack was already inbound, with dive bombers and fighters preparing to drive back in over the harbor. Other guns were firing now, but every weapon that stayed silent gave the attackers one more safe avenue in. On that small platform behind the conning tower, the question was brutally simple. Either those two Brownings would come fully alive, or more planes would get a clean run at the dying battleship, and the men still trapped inside. Miller could have stepped back into the familiar role the Navy had written for him and waited for a real gunner to take over. Instead, he leaned into the grips, fixed his eyes on the next formation, turning in toward Battleship Row, and committed himself to learning under fire. The countdown was over. The next seconds would decide whether his choice mattered at all. When Doris Miller wrapped his hands around the grips of the starboard 50 caliber gun. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been going on for only a few minutes. It already felt like hours. Torpedoes had torn open West Virginia's port side. The ship was listing, her decks slick with oil and water. The air shook with the constant overlapping noise of explosions, engines, and gunfire. The 50 cal Browning in front of him was a simple, brutal machine. Each trigger squeeze unleashed a stream of half-inch rounds at roughly 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Heavy bullets designed to tear through metal, engines, and control surfaces. The sights were fixed. There was no time to think about ballistic tables or lead angles. Miller had a rough idea of how fast the planes were moving, and almost no idea how much to hold in front of them. He sighted on the first torpedo bomber he could see clearly, and squeezed anyway. The gun slammed into his shoulders through the grips. Tracer rounds reached out in a bright line, then arced behind the target and disappeared into the smoke over the harbor. The Japanese plane did not flinch. It kept boring in low over the water. A Nakajima B-5N caked with a torpedo already gone from its belly, pulling away at more than 100 knots. Miller corrected instinctively, dragging the gun's muzzle forward, trying to put the stream of fire where the aircraft would be, not where it had been. On the port side of the platform, an officer worked the twin of his gun, shouting occasional corrections that were mostly lost in the roar. Lead them more, shorter bursts. Whether or not Miller heard every word, he could see the difference between tracers that stitched neatly across a flight path and those that clawed uselessly at empty sky. He shortened his trigger pulls and focused on keeping the weapon under control, letting the natural rhythm of its recoil guide him, below and ahead. Torpedo bombers had already done their worst against the battleships moored along Ford Island. Pillars of water and oil rose around Oklahoma, California, and Nevada. Farther down the row, Arizona detonated in a blinding flash as her forward magazine exploded, the shockwave rolling across the harbor and washing over West Virginia's decks. For a moment, the entire platform seemed to lift. Miller stayed on his feet and kept firing. His first clear chance came against a Japanese plane climbing away after a run on another ship. Probably one of the level bombers that had just dropped on the battleship line. It rose to perhaps 1,000 feet. Banking left into a shallow turn that exposed its belly, Miller walked his tracers ahead of the aircraft, saw them cross its flight path, and held the trigger for a heartbeat longer. The engine cowling puffed grey, then black, and a smear of smoke trailed out behind the plane. It did not explode or fall straight away, but its climb faltered and it slipped back toward the far side of the harbor. Losing altitude. Was that a kill? In the moment, there was no time to mark it. Men at other guns shouted and pointed. Someone yelled that he had hit it. The plane disappeared behind a wall of smoke drifting from another burning ship. Official accounts later would be cautious, crediting Miller with at least one, possibly 2 aircraft destroyed. Survivors recalled that, from the perspective of West Virginia's gun platforms, any plane that trailed smoke and then vanished behind the mess of explosions and burning oil felt like one more taken out of the sky. Miller did not chase satisfaction. He chased shapes. Another aircraft came into view, lower and faster, maybe 1,200 yards out and closing, lining up on the crippled ships. He swung the Browning hard through its traverse arc, fighting the inertia of the gun and the instability of the deck. Tracers reached out again, initially lagging behind the target. He adjusted, carving a lead ahead of the nose. This time the stream of rounds intersected the plane more cleanly. A flash sparked near the wing root. The aircraft lurched, wobbled, and then peeled away, losing height rapidly toward the entrance of the harbor. Around him, other guns on West Virginia and neighboring ships were finding their rhythm. The sound of scattered fire was turning into something closer to continuous. The harbor's air defenses would never be able to stop the first wave entirely, but they were now forcing Japanese pilots to fly through a dense weave of tracer fire to deliver their attacks. Some still made clean runs. Others were forced into steeper dives or hurried drops, degrading accuracy. On the gun platform, Miller's world shrank to the arc of sky in front of him and the feel of the metal grips under his hands. He fought the weapon as much as he fought the enemy. The ship's list meant he was no longer standing on a level surface. Each step had to be planted with care. Spent casings poured out in a steady stream, clanging against the deck and piling up around his boots. The hot stink of gunpowder and burning oil wrapped around him. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with flecks of soot every time a bomb went off nearby. The concussion slapped his eardrums and rattled the gun mount. He gritted his teeth and kept his eyes on the incoming formations. There were near misses. 2. Several times he watched his tracers pass just under a diving bomber. Close enough that for a split second he could see the red insignia on the wings and the glint of the glass canopy before it flashed out of his field of view. The sense of frustration was immediate and physical. At a range of a few hundred yards and closing speeds, pushing 300 miles per hour. A fraction of a second's delay in squeezing the trigger meant the difference between cutting into an engine block and carving a harmless line through empty air. On one pass, a Zero fighter swung in low, raking the battleships with machine gun fire. Miller snapped his gun toward it and fired, but the agile fighter jinked right at the last instant and screamed past the platform. So close that he could feel the prop wash tug at his clothes. He did not have the kind of traverse or elevation control needed to track a target that close in and that fast. The 50 cal was a brutal weapon, but it was not a magic wand, phase by phase. Though his confidence grew, the first few bursts had been wild, more noise than effect. As the minutes passed, his tracers began to find the right lines more often. He learned to pick out the planes that presented the best angles, those pulling up from an attack run or turning broadside in front of the ship. He learned to ignore shapes that were already past the optimal firing arc and move on to the next threat instead of wasting ammunition. Men on the deck below looked up between tasks and saw a big mess attendant at a gun mount, firing with the intensity of a trained anti-aircraft gunner. Many of them did not even know his name. They just saw a silhouette behind a Browning that had been silent when they needed it most, now spitting fire into the sky. The first wave of attackers began to pull away, fuel clocks ticking down in their cockpits, bombs and torpedoes expended. Smoke rose from shattered battleships along Ford Island, from airfields hit in the opening minutes, from fuel dumps and hangars. For a brief moment, the pressure on the gun platform eased. Miller used the lull to check his stance, flex aching fingers, and suck in air that tasted of burned metal. Somewhere behind him, someone was feeding a fresh belt into the receiver. He had not counted hits. He had not kept track of time. All he knew was that he had stepped into someone else's job, and the world had not ended yet. The guns were hot. The ship was still afloat, though settling, and out to the north, beyond the columns of smoke. More dots were forming in the sky as the second wave of Japanese planes turned inward for their run. Phase 1 of the fight had proven one thing a mess attendant could. Under fire and behind a 50 caliber Browning and make Japanese pilots work harder to kill his ship. Whether that would be enough when the next wave came in was an entirely different question. The brief lull between waves felt less like a break and more like someone lifting their boot for the next stomp. On the platform behind West Virginia's conning tower, Doris Miller knew only that the immediate targets in his sights had disappeared and that the gun in his hands was still working. Down below, damage control teams were fighting to keep the ship upright as water poured into the torn port side. Across the harbor, smoke marked where other battleships and airfields were burning, out to the north and east. The second wave of the attack was already lining up. This time, the emphasis was different. The first strike had focused on battleships and airfields. The second wave brought more dive bombers and fighters looking to finish off cripples, hit surviving ships, and suppress whatever anti-aircraft fire the Americans had managed to bring to life. To the men on West Virginia's decks, it meant one thing: whatever was still working was about to be tested harder. From his position, Miller could see new aircraft rolling in at medium altitude, peeling off into steep dives aimed at the harbor. They were smaller and quicker than the torpedo bombers, harder to track, and they came in from multiple directions. He planted his feet, felt the ship's list under his boots, and waited for each target to cross through the narrow slice of sky his gun could cover. The first real test of the second wave came when a group of dive bombers lined up on the area around West Virginia and Tennessee. As one aircraft rolled into its dive, its path took it across his field of fire. Miller began his burst early, leading the plane as best he could, watching the tracers climb toward it. For a second, it looked as though he had misjudged again. Then the line of fire intersected the aircraft's path more cleanly than before. Something on the fuselage sparked. The bomber wobbled in its dive, corrected just enough to release its bomb, and then pulled out, trailing a thicker, darker smoke. Whether the bomb hit home on another target, Miller could not tell. What he did see was the damaged plane limping away at low altitude, losing height over the far side of the harbor. Someone on the platform shouted that he had nailed it. He did what he had done in the first wave. He let the smoke trail count as good enough and looked for the next threat. The second wave's fighters were more aggressive around the gun positions. Mitsubishi A6M0s came in low, strafing decks and exposed crews with machine guns and 20mm cannon fire. One of them angled in along West Virginia's superstructure, stitching the area around the bridge with rounds. Miller swung his gun toward it and opened fire, but the fighters' closing speed and jinking path made it a harder target than the dive bombers. Tracers flashed close. The Zero banked away. Maybe nicked, maybe untouched. He shifted again, hunting for something he could hit more decisively. This was the pattern of the second phase, the mess attendant turned gunner, fighting not only the enemy but the limits of his equipment and his own rapidly acquired skill. Some bursts went wide, some forced pilots to break off or adjust their runs. A few found the narrow window where speed, angle, and aim lined up. From different vantage points around the harbor, men later remembered seeing Japanese aircraft pull up from attacks on West Virginia or nearby ships and then tumble away smoking under fire from that section of the battleship. Some counted 2 clear shoot-downs from his side of the platform. Others were convinced there were more. On the paperwork that followed, those impressions would be boiled down into a conservative line about him helping to down enemy planes, in conversations on deck in the days and weeks after. The number that came up most often was 4 in roughly 15 minutes of firing. That figure would lodge in memory and headlines, surviving long after the debris had been cleared from the harbor. In the moment, Miller had no way to know what number would be attached to his name. His world was nothing but target, lead, recoil, reload. As the second wave ran its course, the physical strain began to tell. The recoil of the Browning had been pounding into his arms and shoulders without pause. The weight of the gun, the uneven deck, and the constant need to traverse and elevate the barrel turned every burst into a small wrestling match. Heat radiated off the receiver. The barrel shroud shimmered. Empty casings now lay ankle-deep around his boots, hot brass shifting underfoot every time he moved. At the same time, the ship beneath him was losing its own fight. Additional bomb hits drove fires deeper into the superstructure. Counterflooding had kept West Virginia from capsizing, but she was settling lower in the water, her port side already buried. Smoke from nearby ships. Arizona's catastrophic explosion. Oklahoma's roll. Fuel fires from ruptured tanks mixed with her own. The air grew thicker with every passing minute. Eventually, the intensity of incoming fire slackened. Japanese aircraft pulled away to regroup and then headed back toward their carriers. The sky over Pearl Harbor did not become clear. The smoke was too heavy for that, but the ripping sound of close strafing runs and diving engines faded. Here and there, lone stragglers made a last pass, but the organized waves were over. The attack that had seemed endless had, in fact, lasted less than 2 hours from first bomb to final withdrawal. on the battered platforms of West Virginia. There was a different kind of noise, now shouted orders to cease fire. Calls for stretcher parties, the clatter of equipment being shifted as the crew tried to keep the ship afloat and tend to the wounded. Someone tapped Miller on the shoulder, yelled at him to secure the gun, and pointed him back toward the interior of the ship. He stepped away from the Browning, his ears ringing, hands buzzing from recoil and vibration, and turned back into the smoke-filled passageways he knew so well. What followed for him was not glory, but more hard work. He joined other sailors in carrying injured men to safer spots, helping get them into boats or onto less damaged sections of the ship. As flooding made it clear that West Virginia was going to settle on the shallow bottom of the harbor, officers gave the order to abandon ship for those not required to stay. Miller climbed down ropes and gangways into boats or onto makeshift rafts, making room for men in worse shape than he was. By the time he reached relative safety offshore, his white uniform was stained with oil, soot, and blood. On the water, looking back, he could see how bad the morning had been. Battleships that had been visual shorthand for American power now sat broken or burning. Columns of black smoke rose straight up into the trade winds from Arizona, Oklahoma, and California. Smaller vessels moved through the harbor picking up survivors, dodging patches of burning fuel. From that vantage point, it was impossible to pick out one gun platform or one man behind a .50 caliber. But the fact that any American guns had been firing at all in those first chaotic minutes had made a difference. Immediate reactions to Miller's actions were local and personal. Men who had seen him on the gun talked about it that day and in the days after. As the crew regrouped ashore, officers who had been on the bridge or near the conning tower noted his size, his willingness to haul wounded, and his coolness under fire. When it came time to write up accounts of the battle and recommend men for commendations, his name appeared in those early reports, spelled out this time, not just as a Negro messman, for the Navy as an institution. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor was dominated by triage, salvage, and the rush to war. Ships had to be raised, repaired, or written off. New battleship and carrier schedules had to be accelerated. Training, intelligence, and communications all demanded urgent attention. In that rush, the story of a black mess attendant who had manned a machine gun was a small line in a stack of after-action reports. Among the men who had lived through the attack, it did not feel small. They knew what it had meant in the moment to see a man the system labeled help step into a gap. No one had prepared him for and start fighting back. In their minds, the image of that big sailor behind the Browning and the hazy count of how many planes they thought he had hit would stay tied to the worst morning of their lives. The official system would take longer to catch up with what they had seen. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the Navy almost let Doris Miller's story slip into anonymity. Early press releases spoke of an unknown Negro messman who had helped save his captain and fired a machine gun during the attack. Black newspapers and civil rights organizations refused to let that stand. They pushed for his name, his face, and his actions to be recognized in full. Under growing public pressure, the Navy eventually identified him, and President Roosevelt approved the award of the Navy Cross for his courage on West Virginia. In May 1942, on the flight deck of the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz pinned the Navy Cross on Miller's chest, making him the first black sailor in history to receive that decoration. The medal did not magically rewrite his career. After the ceremony and a war bond tour that took him back through his hometown of Waco and to black training commands, he returned to the same rating structure that had confined him before the war. He served aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis from late 1941 into 1943, still in the mess and galley, still technically outside the Navy's combat ratings. Then he received orders to the new escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay, again as a messman promoted into cook third class. On November 24, 1943, off Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Liscombe Bay took a torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-175 that detonated her bomb magazine. The ship blew apart and sank in minutes, killing 702 officers and men in one of the deadliest carrier losses in U.S. Navy history. Doris Miller was among the missing. He was 24 years old. His body was never recovered. He was carried on the rolls as missing, then declared killed in action a year later. The institution he served took longer to change than he did. Miller's Navy Cross and the coverage around it helped fuel arguments for opening more roles to black sailors during the war and for desegregating the armed forces afterward. His story appeared on recruiting posters, in newsreels, and in the black press as proof that courage under fire did not respect the color line. Historians and veterans have long pointed out the hypocrisy. A man trusted in death with a .50 caliber gun was still not trusted in life with a combat rating or a fair shot at promotion. But his example, and that of thousands of other black service members, helped push the Navy and the rest of the U.S. military toward President Truman's 1948 order to end official segregation in the armed forces. Long after the war, the honors caught up with his memory. A destroyer escort, U.S. Miller DE 1091, carried his name during the Cold War. In 2020, the Navy went further, announcing that a future Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier would be named U.S. Doris Miller, CVN-81, the first time an American aircraft carrier would be named for an enlisted sailor and an African American. For a man once listed only as an unknown Negro sailor, having his name on the flight deck of a nuclear-powered carrier is a statement as loud as any medal citation. The exact number of planes he brought down over Pearl Harbor will probably never be settled. Official records credit him with 1 confirmed kill, maybe 2. Miller himself never claimed more than that. Yet the men who watched him behind that Browning on West Virginia remembered something larger. A black mess attendant who had been told all his life to stay in the background, standing in the open on a burning battleship, drawing a line of fire across the sky and forcing trained enemy pilots to fight for every attack run they made. In their memories, that looked like 4 planes in about 15 minutes, and the numbers mattered less than the fact that he had stepped up at all. His story leaves a few hard lessons behind. One is that individual courage can punch straight through the layers of prejudice and bureaucracy that surround it, at least for a moment, when lives are on the line. Another is that a system willing to waste human potential because of race or status is not just unjust, it is tactically stupid. On December 7, 1941, the Navy discovered that some of the help it had boxed into steward roles were also the men who could keep guns firing when trained gunners were down. And a third is that even when heroism forces an institution to look in the mirror, change comes slowly and often too late for the people whose actions exposed the problem in the first place. If this story of Doris Dorie Miller hit you even a fraction as hard as it hit us, I'm going to ask you for one small favor that matters more than it looks. Tap that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to put this piece of history in front of more people, so men like Miller don't slip back into a single forgotten line in an old report. Make sure you're subscribed to WW2 Echo Stories and turn on notifications, because we're pulling real accounts out of logs, letters, and dusty archives all the time, not movie heroes, but real sailors, soldiers, airmen, and civilians who carried the weight when it counted. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere completely different? And if someone in your family served in World War II, tell us a little bit about them so their name sits next to his in this space. You're not just an audience number to this channel. You're part of the small group of people keeping these memories alive. Thank you for being here, And thank you for helping make sure Doris Dorie Miller never disappears into silence.